Hi again, everybody. This is the second public opinion lecture. It's a beautiful day outside. It's summer. It's Wyoming, so I thought I'd include a picture of me catching a trout at my favorite fishing spot just right beside Mirror Lake up in the Snowies. Okay, let's talk about public opinion again. So last time we talked about John Zaller's theory. This slide is basically a reiteration or a summary of what we talked about last time. But just to review, he created a unified theory of public opinion. The foundation of the theory is that opinions as we think of them don't exist. Most people aren't thinking about politics, and so a quote opinion is not a position or a firm belief for most people. He defined an opinion as, quote, a sample of considerations, and consideration is just anything bouncing around your head at the time. We're going to talk about partisanship, but it could be race, religion, personal experiences, basically anything that helps a person respond. And sample just refers to a summary of the considerations, the pros and cons bouncing around your head. So let me illustrate how this works with our pal Homer here. Let's imagine that he's an average American, and you've got the plus and minus signs over to the right. These are the considerations. Let's say that, Homer is listening to a speech by the president, and he hears something positive, okay, that goes in there. He hears something negative about the president and maybe something else he doesn't like that the president said. These things go in his head. Those are the considerations bouncing around. And when he's asked his opinion about the president's job approval, then he samples them and says, because there's two negative and one positive, says he disapproves of the job that President Obama is doing. So this is what we mean when we talk about an opinion being a sample of considerations. So let's talk about John Zaller's theory specifically. This is new information, so you'll want to take notes and pay attention here. How do the considerations get into people's heads? John Zaller refers to his theory as the RAS model. It's simply a three-step process that people use for forming their, quote, opinion. The first step is receive. People have to be exposed to political messages in order to use them or in order for them to become a consideration. These are things that people see on television, radio, newspapers, or somehow daily conversations about politics that occur during their daily lives. And it should be obvious that those who pay the most attention to politics are the most likely to hear these messages. Remember, this is an elite-driven democracy idea, so when the political elites say something, the people who pay the most attention to politics are the most likely to hear what they say. So the receive part is really about exposure to the political chatter, all the persuasive messages and arguments that are made on the media by the politicians. That's the first step. The second step is what he calls the accept stage. Basically, once you receive a piece of information, you have to choose whether to accept or reject it, whether it becomes a consideration in your head. So people will only accept an argument if it agrees with their party identification. Now, in fact, if you read Zaller's book, what he refers to as predispositions is actually much broader. We're going to use party identification because it's the easiest one to understand, and in fact, it's the most powerful. So if they hear something, let's say the president's giving a speech, and they hear something that agrees with their party identification, they'll accept that. If it disagrees with their party identification, they'll reject it. This also includes sources of the information. So a Democrat listening to President Obama's speech is going to agree with what he says or accept the arguments he makes simply because he's a Democrat. And a Republican listening to the speech is going to reject the things that Obama says simply because he's a Democrat and the person's a Republican. The reality is most people incorporate some messages from both sides. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but it is important to understand that there are some messages that are just so factually based or so obvious that nobody can really rationalize them away. The state of the economy, for instance, is a big one. If in 2008, everybody accepted that the economy was terrible. In 2010, everybody accepted the economy was still doing badly. I'd say everybody, most people did. And then the last stage we've already talked about, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, which is this notion that opinions are simply a sample of considerations. So walking through the three steps very quickly, people who pay a lot of attention to politics hear a lot of the media chatter. So they're going to be exposed to a lot of the persuasive messages. Once they're exposed to those persuasive messages, they have to choose to accept or reject it. And they do this based on whether it's consistent with their party identification. So if you ask somebody about Obamacare, the person's a Democrat, they're going to like it because they will have accepted the positive messages about Obamacare and rejected the negative ones. If the person's a Republican, however, they're going to have rejected the positive messages about Obamacare and they're going to accept the negative ones, so they're going to be opposed to it. So here's a quick example. I already went through it. Democrats will accept the messages that Obama tells them all the great things about Obamacare. They're going to accept it. Republicans are going to reject most of those. And so the sample of considerations, people who are more pro-Obama, that is, say, Democrats, are going to accept the messages, and those who are anti-Obama are going to reject it, which means the sample of considerations for a Democrat is going to be mostly pro-Obama. And then when you ask a Democrat, do you support or oppose, do you support or oppose the job the president's doing, they're going to say he's doing a good job because they've incorporated those pro-Obama considerations. With the Republicans, again, it's going to be the exact opposite. So let's go back to Homer Simpson. Notice the difference here is that I've put up a little screen that says Democrat. This is party identification. Let's say that Homer the Democrat is paying attention to the convention, and in paying attention to the news, he's hearing these different messages from Republicans and Democrats. Up in the upper top, you see a cloud of political chatter. This is the media environment. This is simply the D stands for a pro-Democratic message. The R stands for a pro-Republican message. So he hears something that is positive. How does he incorporate it? Notice again, the Democrat is a party identification. It filters the messages during the accept phase. So he hears pro-Democratic message. He's a Democrat. It makes it through his filter. He hears another one. It also gets in his head, becomes a consideration. He hears a pro-Republican message. He's a Democrat, so he rejects that. Democratic message makes it back in. Maybe one pro-Republican message makes it in there, but the others just bounce right off and he rejects them. Notice the composition of the messages here, of the considerations in his head. They lean heavily towards the Democratic side because he's rejected pro-Republican messages. On the Republican side, same thing, just in reverse. These Republican persuasive messages, they make it into his head as consideration. The pro-Democratic ones bounce off. And at the end of the day, even though one pro-Democratic message made it into his head, still the composition or the sample of considerations bouncing around the Republican Homer's head is pro-Republican. So if you ask Republican Homer, he's going to say Obama's doing a bad job. If you ask Democratic Homer, he's going to say Obama's doing a good job. Again, it's a simple process, but the two main important parts of this are the receive and the accept. Right? The receive tells us how many considerations or how many messages people will have heard, and the accept tells us which ones they'll accept or reject. And so that then tells us the composition or the balance of considerations in their head, and that tells us what their, quote, opinion or their response on a poll is going to be. So let's talk about some implications. One of the most important implications for his RAS model is that information and party identification work together. You can't think about these two things as different or as separate, right? The reason is, and this isn't anything based on theory, it's just a simple empirical reality, is that the least aware, or the people who are least passionate about politics, the people who pay the least attention to politics, they are also the weakest partisans. They have the weakest partisanship. You don't find many diehard Republicans who don't pay a lot of attention to politics. You don't find a lot of strong Democrats and diehard Democrats who don't pay a lot of attention to politics. So the least aware have the weakest filters. They have the weakest party identification. The moderately aware, as the name suggests, they pay some attention to politics some of the time. They tend to have moderately strong party identification. And then importantly, the most aware, the people who are the most passionate about politics, who care the most, they're the news junkies, they consume the most political information, they're the ones that have the strongest party identification. And because they have the strongest party identification, they're going to be the ones that blindly accept what their side says. So if you look down at the Homer skulls in the bottom, you can see for the least aware Homer that he has a weak partisanship, so he incorporates both sides' arguments, but he doesn't pay a lot of attention to politics, so he only has a few bouncing around his head. If you look at moderately aware Homer, and we're going to assume he's a Republican, then he's going to incorporate more Republican than Democratic messages, also doesn't have a whole lot of considerations bouncing around his head. And then on the far right, you look at the most aware Republican Homer. He's passionate about politics. He pays a lot of attention to politics. He's going to have the most considerations, and all of those considerations are going to be Republican because he's Republican, he's rejected all of the pro-democratic messages. So hopefully you can see visually how these two things work together. The receive is about how many of those R's and D's are in people's heads, and the accept stage is about which of the R's and, whether there are more R's than D's or D's than R's. So implication 2, notice in talking about this, how people form their quote opinions, there's nothing in here about critical thinking or deliberation. It's merely accepting or rejecting the messages based on how much attention you pay to politics. So people, according to Zaller's model, actually react like a robot. They blindly accept things because it comes from their side, or they blindly reject things because it comes from their side. And one of the more disturbing and counterintuitive ideas behind this is that this is especially true among the most aware. The people who care the most about politics, who are the most informed, they're the ones who are most likely to act like a blind robot or a sheep that merely follows whatever their side says. Now, I'm going to give you some polling results and survey evidence to support this, but let that wash over you a second. Let that really sink in. The people who are the most likely to reflect an informed citizenry, the people who are the most informed and the most likely to participate in political discussions, are the most likely to blindly, robotically accept or reject things simply because it comes from their side. And that leads directly to implication number 3, or the third consequence of this model, which has to do with conspiracy theories. Now, if you talk enough with people who believe in these conspiracy theories, you'll find that there are a lot of people out there who are otherwise very normal people, but they still accept some ideas that are pretty out there, pretty crazy. Why are the people that are most likely to accept the conspiracy theories also the most highly informed Americans? Well, again, we'll go back and explain it with John Zaller's theory. But once you look at the graph in the upper right-hand corner, this is a percent of Republicans, Democrats, and Independents who say that they believe in one of two conspiracy theories. The first one is the idea that Obama was not born in the United States. There's a conspiracy theory out there that he was born in Kenya and somehow manipulated his birth certificate. Completely not true. There's another myth out there that President Bush knew about 9/11 before it happened, allowed it to happen, or even that it was a secret government conspiracy that was orchestrated by President Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney. Also completely not true. But notice that among Democrats, over 40% of them believe in the 9/11 conspiracy. And among Republicans, over 40% believe that Obama was not born in the United States. And if you broke this up by level of information, the number of the number of highly informed Democrats who believe in the 9/11 conspiracy would jump over 50%. And the percentage of Republicans who believe that Obama was not born in the United States, that percentage would jump also over 50% for the most highly informed Republicans. So this is what I meant when I said we're going to crazy town, because as far as I know, there's no other way to explain this other than John Zaller's theory. Why are Democrats so much more likely to believe in a 9/11 conspiracy than the conspiracy about Obama being born in Kenya? It's simply because they accept anything that's consistent with their party identification and reject anything that isn't. And so 9/11 as a conspiracy is a negative information about Bush. Democrats don't like President Bush, so they accept it. The conspiracy about Obama is negative about Democrats. Democrats like Obama, they reject it. And the same is true for Republicans on the other side. So this accept part and the use of party identification as a filter for information can actually explain why so many people accept conspiracy theories that have no basis in fact, and more disturbingly, why it is the most informed Americans who are the most likely to accept those conspiracies as long as they're consistent with their partisanship. So let's look at a couple of other examples. This is also about the question about President Bush knew about 9/11 attacks before they occurred. Again, notice that 36% of Democrats said that that was probably true, and 12% of Republicans said it was probably true. So again, Democrats are much more likely to buy into this conspiracy theory. Let's look at another one. This is a poll by the polling group PPP. And they asked people, do you believe that Obama is the Antichrist? And they broke down the results by people who are very liberal to very conservative. You can think about liberal as being more Democratic and conservative as being more Republican. Again, it's simply, does this conspiracy theory, is it consistent with their predispositions, their partisanship, their ideology, and so forth? For Democrats, for very liberal people, it is not consistent, so only 8% of them believe that Obama is the Antichrist. Among very conservative individuals, though, 21% said yes, Obama is the Antichrist. And again, I don't know how you can explain these differences between very liberal and very conservative, and the notion that it is the most informed because people who are very liberal or very conservative are also the most informed and active, and they're more likely to be the news junkies, why they're more likely to accept a conspiracy theory if it is consistent with their political views. And then just to show you that this is not unique to America, that John Zaller's model, including this notion of conspiracy theories, has been applied all around the world to other countries. We can take a look at a poll that was done in Pakistan. And it asked Pakistani citizens, do you believe that groups of Arabs carried out the attacks against the United States on September 11th? Now, this is obviously true. The people who carried out the attacks were terrorists, and they're terrorists from Arab countries. And so the correct answer to this would be, yes, I believe it. Now, I took the poll and I broke it down by level of education. We've been using terms like aware or informed. You can also use education. All three will get you the same results. So the more educated people are, the more they tend to pay attention to politics, and they tend to have stronger beliefs about politics. So the people with the lowest level of education, only about 43% believed that that was true. That's still a low number, right? 47% didn't believe it. But look what happens when you go to the highest level of education, people with a postgraduate degree. Now remember, these are people who have PhDs. These are medical doctors. These are lawyers. These are people with a very high level of education. And only 22% of them said that they believed that a group of Arabs carried out the attacks against the United States on September 11th. 70% of them said that they do not believe that was the case. So in this case, actually in all the cases we've been talking about, the more informed a person is, the more likely they are to be misinformed about certain aspects. The more informed they are, the more likely they are to believe in conspiracy theories. The more informed they are, the more likely they are to reject information that's inconsistent with it, even if that information is factually true. And this is true of liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans. It's just almost a universal tendency among people, and it's a universal tendency that we see across a lot of different countries. These are 4 examples I've given you. I could give you dozens, actually. And feel free to email me if you want some more examples of this, because, yeah, as hilarious as it is, it's also kind of disturbing that the people who most embody the classic notion of democratic citizenship, they're informed, they pay attention, they care about the outcome, they talk about politics, they're the ones that are most likely to buy into crazy conspiracy theories or to reject things that are factually true just because it conflicts with their party identification or somehow their predispositions. So let's wrap this up, the second part of public opinion, and acknowledge that some of this is really depressing and some of this is very disturbing. But it also leads some fascinating questions about democracy, which is, do we really want informed, passionate citizens? A lot of media commentary look to the problems in politics today and say, oh, if only the American citizens were more informed, if only people knew more about politics. Well, the reality is that if everybody were highly informed and participate in politics, you'd have more blind partisans. And you'd have more people who accepted conspiracy theories. You'd have more people who were simply rejecting information because it disagreed with their party identification, even if that information is true. So while this is depressing and disturbing, it's unfortunately also very, very accurate description of the American public in terms of public opinion. That may be one of the most counterintuitive aspects of public opinion, that it really raises a question: do we really want citizens who are highly aware and highly informed about politics? Do we want people who are passionate and involved with politics? And Zaller's theory suggests that there could be some very negative consequences of that. People would be more polarized. They would agree less on basic factual things, and they'd be more likely to accept insane conspiracy theories about the other side. Now, against that backdrop, I'll leave you with a little bit of room for optimism, which is that ordinary Americans, which is to say most Americans, they're moderately aware. They pay some attention to politics, and they're only moderately partisan. They'll accept some things from the other side, which is to say that ordinary Americans and most Americans are still mostly reasonable in their opinions, right? The reason that only about a quarter of America believes that Obama's secret Muslim Kenyan from outer space appeared to steal our bacon or whatever, or they believe that Bush Cheney orchestrated 9/11 to get blood money for oil from Halliburton and also steal our bacon. I don't know. Most Americans don't believe that. They reject those ideas. They recognize that they're not true. And only a small percent of Americans, but also the Americans who are highly informed about politics and the most partisan and passionate about it, they're the only ones that really accept it. So I don't want to freak you out too much about the nature of public opinion. Most people most of the time are reasonable. It's only the people who are really passionate and the news junkies who are also the ones that buy into pretty insane conspiracy theories. So as disturbing and depressing as it is, I hope that gives you a small glimmer of light at the end of public opinion, and I hope you enjoyed the lecture, or again, maybe enjoy isn't the right word. I hope you found it fascinating. This is a topic that I find very interesting. And the next lecture, we're going to pick up a little bit on polling and how to interpret and read polls. And then we're going to turn to voting behavior, which is why do people show up to the polls on election day versus staying at home? And why do they vote for one candidate or the other? And we're going to look ahead to the 2016 general election for president in November and hopefully get some insight into what's likely to happen.